Argentina slaps a fine on its president, the Colombian presidential race is heating up, and Brazil is in the midst of police brutality. All that and more on this week's edition of LATAM Weekly. There is not many things that Brits and Argentinians agree on, with the biggest chasm being the Falkland Islands, or Islas Malvinas if you're Argentinian. However, what we can agree on is when our governments have been complete and utter twats. And that is because in July 2020, Argentina's President Alberto Fernandez was seen at his wife's dinner party celebrating her birthday in the midst of a strict COVID lockdown in Argentina. Now, to see your own president break the rules is bad enough, but to see them fined properly is how it should be done. Fernandez was fined 3 million Argentinian pesos, which is the equivalent of £20,000 or about $25,000. This is all whilst Argentina was enduring a strict COVID lockdown where only essential meetings were permitted, and many millions of Argentinians were struggling to choose between work or a global health emergency. The hypocrisy of politicians is unrivaled around the world at the moment. Look at Boris Johnson. He received a £50 fine for breaking the lockdown rules, and he attended multiple parties. When you see Argentina's president get a £20,000 fine, it makes you wonder, who really is in charge of our country? Boris Johnson attended multiple parties, whereas Fernandez is seen at one. And look at the consequences. Look at the consequences. Anyway, this is about Latin America. I'd just like to point out that this has happened all around the world. The politicians cannot keep up appearances, can they? The ones who make the rules can't even stick to their own. And whether it's in Britain or Argentina, it continues to happen around the world. Heading over to Peru, President Castillo has changed his cabinet for the 5th time since coming to office in 2021. He has made Alessandra Herrera the Energy and Mines Minister to try and solve the crisis in Las Bambas, which is one of the world's biggest copper mines, produces 20% of Peru's output and 2% of the world's copper supply. Protesters from the Fuerabamba community have been blocking the mine in recent weeks, months and years in an effort to what they say is to gain a greater share of the profits and get their ancestral lands back. Around a decade ago, Chinese company MMG decided to relocate the community at a cost of $160 million. As spoken about previously, they created a new town about 20 kilometers away called Nueva Fuerabamba, where the residents could live whilst they scaled up copper production in the area. However, when you look at MMG's profits from the Las Bambas mine alone, which I believe was around $2 billion in the year 2019, 161 million doesn't actually look that good in the grand scheme of things. And when you consider the community has been relocated from their ancestral lands, there is no doubt that this anger is justified at a time when Peru, like many other countries, is dealing with a cost of living crisis, inflation hikes, and a huge scaling back of government services. President Castillo was elected on the mandate that he would share more of Peru's natural resources. Now, the disruption that this has caused across the country is making him, let's just say, rethink his policies, because 1.5% of the Peruvian GDP has been paralysed by these protests, which aren't just happening in Las Bambas, they're happening all across Peru, including in Chile, which is a bigger producer of copper. The government met with protesters on Tuesday to discuss the situation, but talks have been absolutely fruitless. Unfortunately, resource exploitation is all too common in Latin America, and you may not consider this exploitation because the Chinese company went in there, negotiated and started producing copper from the mine. However, when you look at the initial compensation, it's robbery. It's robbery. And in the words of Eduardo Galeano, the open veins of Latin America have been opened. Okay, I just made up that quote. That's just the cover of the book, but it's a great book. And if you want to know more about South America, read it. And when many of these communities don't have the access to lawyers, legal firms, and the knowledge of what money is on a corporate scale, then it really demands that the Peruvian government make the right decision on this and try to broker some kind of deal between MMG, the Fuerabamba community, and the Peruvian government, because no one needs these protests, but the protesters have said they are willing to stay for as long as possible to get what they need and get their ancestral lands back. President Castillo needs to do something. And now we're moving over to Colombia, where the presidential race is heating up to its boiling point. Gustavo Petro, former M19 guerrilla and mayor of Bogota, is polling at around 40%, with Fico Gutierrez at 25% and Rodolfo Hernandez at about 20%. Voting opens on Sunday, which is going to be yesterday by the time I get this video out. However, I'm going to be bringing you all the analysis in next week's episode. But for now, let me tell you about some of the candidates. Gustavo Petro, who is the front runner at the moment, was a former M19 guerrilla back in his younger days, the group that was responsible for the Supreme Court raid that killed nearly 90 people. Petro is seeking to be the first leftist president in Colombian history. Now, Colombian politics has been dominated by right-wing elites since its inception. So this vote is going to be an absolute game changer for Colombian politics. Petro has been making many of his speeches in a bulletproof vest, surrounded by countless bodyguards and bulletproof shields as well. This is because Colombia has a history of assassinations during presidential campaigns. In the 20th century alone, 5 presidential candidates were assassinated on the campaign trail. Outgoing President Ivan Duque says that Petro is being looked after and he is the most protected man in Colombia right now. As Colombia tries to leave its violent past, Gustavo Petro has promised to change the way that Colombia tackles the war on drugs. Petro's ascendance in the presidential campaign has caused shivers up Washington's spine, as Petro doesn't really believe in extradition, nor does he believe in the common approach to tackling drug violence with violence works. Also, Colombia, although it's not a member of NATO, has a special status which allows them access to military aid and intelligence, which other countries do not get. Petro also aims to solve Colombia's vast wealth inequality, transition the country to greener energy away from oil, which many have been very skeptical of, and he also wants to find a solution to their agricultural problems, in which many farmers feel forced into cocoa production. In a stark contrast to Petro, Fico Gutierrez wants to maintain some sort of continuity in Colombian politics, although he does bring some new policies of his own. He's generally considered right-wing. I wouldn't say extremist right, but he is right-wing. He wants to go after corruption in the country. He wants to battle dodgy financing of public contracts. Gutierrez also aims to reduce petty crimes by 50% from 540,000 incidents to 270,000 incidents. Alongside this, he also wants to bring 4G to every single area of Colombia by 2024. And in terms of young people, he wants to introduce a loan repayment system like in the UK, where once you reach a minimum salary threshold, then you can start paying it back. Although Petro remains the favourite among young people. The election is going to be decided by a runoff. This essentially means the 2 candidates with the highest amount of votes go on to the second and final round. Now, although Petro is in the lead by what it looks like a huge margin, in the runoffs this could be a different story, as anti-corruption candidate Rodolfo Hernandez, who's on the side of private business and entrepreneurship, is obviously not going to be favourable to many Petro voters or potential Petro voters, as they are complete opposite of the spectrum, the political spectrum. Now yes, Colombia has gotten more peaceful in the last couple of decades. However, in the last 10 years, cocaine production has tripled, which raises fears in the country that drug violence will return. So whoever becomes president has to tackle this problem, and tackling it is a huge part of each candidate's platform. Gutierrez aims to do this by going after the finances and following a more traditional approach, whereas Petro wants to shake up the policy, go against the establishment, and maybe provide a bridge in which the violence doesn't have to happen. Petro has suggested shifting coca production to legal marijuana production. He has also suggested spraying coca crops with some form of chemical that would essentially kill them. But yeah, this election is hugely important and emblematic of Latin America's overall shift, or pivot, whatever you want to call it, to the left wing. Things are starting to heat up in Brazil's presidential election, where Lula da Silva seems to be pulling away from Jair Bolsonaro at 50 percentage points after a slight dip the other week after he mentioned that President Zelensky of Ukraine was partially to blame for the war in Ukraine. This boost to Lula's popularity sees him set to win the presidential election in October. However, like anything, that's not guaranteed. Current President Jair Bolsonaro has voiced concerns over Brazil's electronic voting system, saying it's liable to fraud. Okay? And you've got to remember that Bolsonaro is a friend of President Trump, or at least inspired by President Trump. President Trump also did that in the 2020 US elections. He said that it was fake and that the results don't matter, they don't count. Bolsonaro looks set to do the same. Maybe this is because Lula looks set to win by an absolute landslide. Bolsonaro hasn't given any evidence as to why Brazil's electronic voting system doesn't work, but in place of this, Brazil's electoral authorities have invited hundreds of representatives from around the world to observe the October presidential election to make sure that all the voting is correct and there is no fraud, intimidation or violence involved. The Organization of American States, the OAS, is sending election observers. The Carter Center in the USA is also going to send some observers, and I believe Parlasur, which is like the parliamentary extension of Mercosur, the South American trade bloc, are also going to send some electoral observers or representatives. As things continue to progress, I'm going to bring you the latest from the run-up to the Brazilian election. Also in Brazil, police have been accused of using excessive force against a 38-year-old man with schizophrenia. In a shocking video, the man is bundled into the back of a police car whilst the police throw a tear grenade into the car, essentially choking the man to death. Later, he was pronounced dead by asphyxiation. Many onlookers spoke of how the police in the video were going to kill him, and look what they did. They ended up doing just that. They realised he was unconscious when they were driving him to hospital. However, by then it was too late, and the brutality that Brazilian police rarely get reprimanded for was on full show. The 38-year-old man was another victim of Brazil's well-known and well-documented police brutality, which disproportionately affects black people at about 80% of the victims. And if Lula is to win office for a third term, then this is one of the issues that he is going to need to address, among reducing Brazil's extreme wealth inequality. And now we're going to crack on with some other news from across the region. We're heading over to Bolivia, where a 52-year-old man, Max Mendoza, has held multiple university leadership positions since the 1990s. This might not be so strange if the guy was actually connected and integrated into the universities, but it's been found that he doesn't even have a bachelor's degree. Now, nothing wrong with that, but the bloke has been trying for 30 years. And now he is being sent to San Pedro prison in Bolivia. Why? Because he made himself head of the University Confederation of Bolivia, where he was taking a salary of $3,000 a month. That is 10 times the average wage in Bolivia. He used the COVID-19 pandemic to extend his leadership, but now the buck stopped. And after being sent to San Pedro prison, one of the most notorious prisons in Bolivia, and now judges are set to wade through months and months and months of investigations into over 30 years of what seems like screwing the system. You can't knock the bloke for ingenuity, but expropriation of public funds is never a good thing. So at the same time, moving on, I want to talk about Title 42. What is Title 42? Title 42 is a United States public health order that was made back in March 2020 by the Trump administration. This effectively closed the US southern border to immigrants due to the fact that there was a pandemic going on, and many were suggesting, Trump was suggesting, that immigrants were to blame for the rise in COVID incidence rates. However, current President Joe Biden has moved to remove Title 42 to allow the flow of immigrants to start again at the southern border. However, 20 states have filed a lawsuit against Biden's administration for doing this because they believe it's going to increase public expenditure at a time when many states could probably not do it. Many have called the lawsuits racist and driven by a Republican agenda to keep migration from Latin America out of the United States. Migrants will just continue to come anyway because they're in search for a better life. The total inaction from the right, considering the school shooting in a majority Hispanic school and the current Title 42 situation, shows that the dollar bill continues to rule over the American people, its politics, and everything that comes with it. And heading back to our favourite event, the Americas Summit, which is still a couple of weeks away. And this week, US officials are considering inviting a Cuban representative to the Americas Summit. This is amidst a wave of objections from countries such as Brazil, Argentina, Nicaragua, Venezuela, and beyond. Mexico, the US's biggest ally, has headed the objections, with AMLO, the Mexican president, saying that he will make a decision later on this week. And on the flip side to last week's episode, Guatemala is now considering coming to the Americas Summit. This might be the biggest political vanity fair that I have ever seen. The Financial Times says that the Americas Summit is supposed to show that the US is back in its own yard. However, I believe this phrasing is exactly the problem. A lot of Latin American nations have grown wary of US diplomacy considering Trump's America First approach, and a lot of Latin American nations felt abandoned when he took that direction. And considering this, Biden's shift back to US internationalism hasn't been as bold and strong as anticipated. And it's also important to consider the role of China, who have invested more than $130 billion in Latin America in the last few years. So it is no secret that the Americas Summit isn't being taken as seriously by even some of the smaller states. Much of Latin America is looking elsewhere for international support now. The world's pivot to Asia has shown that the US is not as needed as they used to be. And it's soon not just going to be America first, it's going to be America only if Biden doesn't get his act together. Thanks for watching this week's edition of LATAM Weekly. I'm going to be bringing you more analysis from the Colombian election next week, so nos vemos y hasta el próximo.